It's May 14th, 1838, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and the heavyweights of the abolition movement have gathered for the wedding of Angelina Grimke and Theodore Weld. She a Quaker, he a Presbyterian. Angelina's sister and fellow abolitionist Sarah is there too, of course. And this wedding, like most things the Grimke Sisters have done in recent years, has caused quite a stir. They're just so very unladylike. Of course, the Quakers are not happy that one of their number is marrying outside of the fold, but that's not the only detail out of the norm. Again, it's 1838, 23 years before the Civil War. Yet, the wedding cake is baked with free trade sugar, the groom signs away rights to his wife's assets, and in her vows, the bride omits the usual promise to obey her beloved. Overseeing the ceremony are not one but two ministers, neither of them Quaker. Even stranger, one is black and one is white. The guest list is also mixed. In attendance are formerly enslaved people, once the property of the bride's family in Charleston. There's an abolitionist newspaperman named William Lloyd Garrison, and there's even a man sporting a long flowing beard that he's vowed to cut only when American slavery has come to an end. This is the sisters' penultimate public event. In a few days, Angelina will deliver an incendiary speech surrounded by an angry mob. And then Sarah, Angelina, and Theodore will almost completely disappear from the abolition movement.
The Quaker
Podcast.
Story, spirit, sound.
I'm Georgia Sparling.
I'm Jon Watts.
So how's it going, John?
Oh, it's going great. Is it time for another history episode?
It is.
Awesome. What are we talking about today?
Well, so if you ask a random person on the street what they know about Quakers, what do they say?
Well, so we did this for the podcast trailer, and I'm assuming you mean something other than Quaker oats.
Yeah, that the Quaker oats is a given, so something other than the oats.
Okay, so yeah, right. So a couple people mentioned silent worship, but I'd say a common thread was that most of them talked about our history.
Right. Like the general public, myself included, doesn't really know a ton about Quakers today, but there is sort of this collective conscience, at least in the States, about certain aspects of Quakers in American history.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. There's a couple of really visible things that we're known for, like founding Pennsylvania. And there's also some political stances we've taken as a group, like I'm thinking in particular of abolition of slavery and participating in the Underground Railroad.
Yes, exactly. Abolition.
Right. So that's a complex topic, right? It's not just cut and dry, all Quakers were abolitionists. In fact, lots of the conversation today around it is that it actually wasn't very simple.
Nothing ever is. I mean, there were factions and arguments, and it took a while for all Quakers to get on board with the anti-slavery movement. And that's why today I want to tell the story of the Grimke Sisters. It's a story of some really unlikely abolitionists who were Quakers for a while.
This is one that I don't really know much about. So what was it that made them unlikely abolitionists?
They were women at a time when women had very little agency. They couldn't vote. They were also women from the South, where they had little to no access to anti-slavery rhetoric, and they came from a religious but slave-owning family.
Okay, I have so many questions, but I'm sure you'll get to them in the episode. So let's do it.
Today, you'll hear from two women who are very enthusiastic Grimke historians. I'll let them introduce themselves.
My name is Louise W. Knight, and I'm a biographer and historian based in Evanston, Illinois, and I'm a visiting scholar in the Gender Studies and Sexuality program at Northwestern University.
Louise has written two biographies on Jane Addams.
And now I'm working on a biography about the Grimke Sisters that will be published by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux in the next couple of years. And what drew me to the Grimke Sisters was their ability to grow and change in increasingly radical directions, which for any biographer, at least to me, seems like a perfect story to capture in a book.
And then there's Leanne Bain.
I'm a tour guide here in Charleston, South Carolina, and I do the Grimke Sisters walking tour, among other ones.
Okay, remember, Louise is the author, Leanne is the tour guide. Let's get started. Honestly, Sarah and Angelina Grimke were some of the most unlikely abolitionists that America has ever produced. To understand how and why they became anti-slavery advocates, it's important to understand where they came from. Let's start with their dad. Here's Leanne.
He was the Supreme Court Justice the Chief Justice for the state of South Carolina. He was one of the gentlemen that ratified the U.S. Constitution for the state of South Carolina. He was our mayor of Charleston for a couple terms. He sat on the House of Representatives.
The Grimkes had a home in town, plus a country estate and a cotton plantation, all populated by enslaved Africans. For the girls, Sarah, who was born in 1792, and Angelina, the youngest Grimke, born 12 and a half years later, slavery was a completely normal institution. In fact, boats arrived full of enslaved Africans, often children, a mere 100 feet from their front door in Charleston. They would surely have heard the cries of these strangers who had arrived in a strange land, sick, emaciated, and chained. Some of them ended up in the Grimke household, and it was not a happy home.
Mrs. Grimke was very distant, very aloof with her children. They describe it as like when she gives them a kiss, it's really out of motherly duty instead of motherly love. And she was into slavery. She thought there was nothing wrong with it.
Leanne says Mrs. Grimke was a harsh master. Her religious leaders had taught her that she had every right to be that way.
If there was a book on the table and you could easily grab the book, she would, ring her bell and have her slave come into the room and hand her that book. And she would walk around the house with a short little whip. It was probably maybe 6 inches. And if she thought that person rolled their eyes, didn't pick up the crumbs, whatever their offense was, she whipped them right then and there. And she had these whips strategically placed around the house.
And clearly, that experience was partly what shaped them.
That's Louise again.
However, many, many people, including their brothers and sisters, witnessed the same kind of thing and didn't become immediate abolitionists. So it's really not the main explanation. Quakerism was definitely part of it, and part of it was, I think, they were brilliant women, and their minds were strong.
Sarah and Angelina had very different personalities. Sarah is a born nurturer, and she's a mother figure to Angelina.
She's got a heart of gold. She's very compassionate. She internalizes a lot of things.
Sarah is still effectively a kid herself when she first begins to understand how horrific slavery is. It's around this time that she's given her first and only slave, an African child named Dinah.
She was probably 9 or 10, and the idea was Sarah was going to become a debutante. At age 15, she was to train this child to be her lady's maid.
We know from Sarah's writing that Dinah was half-starved and afraid to eat when she arrived at the Grimke household. Sarah was able to coax her to eat, and she even tried to teach Dinah to read until her father found out and forbade it. We don't know much else, but by the time Sarah is 16, we know that Dinah has died.
When you go back and read Sarah's letters and things like that, Donna makes her mark on Sarah, and Sarah will write and talk about her for the rest of her life.
Dinah's death changes Sarah, but it takes many more years for her to denounce slavery. Angelina is perhaps even a harder case.
Angelina, on the other hand, is just like Mrs. Grimke growing up. Mrs. Grimke would call those enslaved in our house horrible, nasty names that I don't repeat today. And Angelina will talk the exact same way.
That is, until her nanny, an enslaved woman, confronts Angelina about her derogatory language. She stops using it, but Angelina still doesn't have any problem with slavery. Where Sarah is kind-hearted, Angelina is headstrong and stubborn. The sisters are raised in a religious household, but it's also one where questions and debate are welcomed. Their father is, after all, a lawyer.
They had debates in the house. They argued about what is the basis for your conclusion. Defend your point. And this was a great strength for the sisters to be raised in, right? Because they were free to make up their own mind.
This gave the sisters freedom to formulate their own beliefs. They were also coming of age during the Second Great Awakening, when it wasn't strange for Episcopalians to become Presbyterians to become Baptists. Both sisters experimented with different denominations, but Sarah is the first of the sisters exposed to Quakerism. When she's in her late 20s, she goes with her dad to get medical care in the North, and while they're there, they stay in several Quaker homes. But it's not an immediate love match.
She thought Quakers were fanatical because, of course, they thought slavery was a sin. Nobody in Charleston, in Sarah's world, approved of Quakers.
Judge Grimke dies while they're up north, and on the boat ride home, Sarah meets some upper-crust Quakers who tell her more about their faith. They leave her with some Quaker literature, and in it, she reads about the Quaker stance on slavery, against, and their stance on women ministers, pro.
That was like a crazy idea. There are many reasons she became a Quaker, but that was not small. That was a big one.
A few years later, Sarah moves to Philadelphia to further explore Quakerism and to escape slavery. We hired a couple of voice actors to read portions of the sisters' writing and speeches. What you're about to hear is an excerpt written by Sarah for a book that she, Angelina, and Theodore Weld would assemble many years later.
As I left my native state on account of slavery and deserted the home of my fathers to escape the sound of the lash and the shrieks of tortured victims, I would gladly bury in oblivion the recollection of those scenes with which I have been familiar. But this may not, cannot be. They overcome my memory like gory specters and implore me with resistless power, in the name of a God of mercy, in the name of a crucified Savior, in the name of humanity, for the sake of the slaveholder as well as the slave, to bear witness to the horrors of the Southern prison house.
Sarah immerses herself in the Arch Street meeting in Philly. And of course, she tries to convince Angelina to become a Quaker too. On one visit home, she brings a female Quaker minister with her. Angelina is impressed. She's been on a faith journey of her own and been kicked out of the Presbyterian Church. Quakerism suddenly becomes much more appealing to the headstrong Angelina, but not only because women had more of a voice in the Quaker meeting.
So I'm pretty sure that part of what really drew them to the Quaker faith was also its quietude, its love of silence, its belief in gentleness, its belief that you shouldn't raise your voice. These are all very comforting to these two women who did not feel at all peaceful in the house they grew up in. And I think that's partly what drew them. And also the message of love, which of course every denomination has, every Christian denomination has, but the Quakers are especially insistent upon it permeating your every waking moment, that your whole being should be gentle and loving all the time, and how you greet people, how you listen to people. All those things, I think, were soothing to the sisters given their upbringing.
Angelina finally moves to Philadelphia. It's 1829, 8 years after Sarah joins the Arch Street meeting. The sisters still are not abolitionists yet, but they've become strongly anti-slavery. Surprisingly, they find that the abolition movement within Quakerism isn't quite as robust as they were led to believe.
Each of them arrives in the Quaker community in Philadelphia thinking, oh, right, this is the one religion that thinks owning human beings is a sin. But of course, the times had changed. When the Philadelphia yearly meeting was supporting the gradual abolition movement, it was the 1780s.
Gradual abolition was just like it sounds, a total cop-out.
And that said, at the moment this law takes effect, any enslaved mother whose child is born after that date will become free when they reach the age of X, 21, 27, 28, whatever it was. So it freed no one.
The Philadelphia yearly meeting was comprised of wealthy Quakers whose assets were all tied up in the American economy, much of it powered by slavery. Plus, they had slave-owning friends. As an alternative, many Quakers signed on to the colonization movement.
Which mean any slave owner who wanted to could send the slaves of his or her choice to Africa, to Liberia, and then also we'll invite as many free black people as possible to go to Liberia too. And basically the argument was we'll just gradually rid the country of black people.
Sarah seems to have considered this option for a time, but she'd befriended the Douglas family, the one black family that worshipped at the Arch Street meeting.
They had to sit on a separate bench at the back.
Sarah would sit on that bench with them. And there is correspondence between Sarah Douglas and Sarah Grimke that shows the former warning her friend off of the colonization movement. So the sisters were searching for ways to help, and it was clear that gradual abolition and the colonization movement were total smokescreens.
And it is in that context that the immediate abolition movement emerged.
Immediate abolition was a movement to eradicate slavery right now. Angelina is on board. She's also been attending abolitionist meetings, and she writes a letter that will thrust her into the spotlight, close the door on Sarah's dreams, and estrange the sisters from Quakerism forever. That's after the break.
Hey, Jon.
Hey, Erin. Thanks for taking a second to talk with me.
Yeah, for sure.
So you and I have been in touch a lot recently because we're working together on the Intermountain Yearly Meeting gathering in Colorado this summer. And at some point in that process, you mentioned that you were relatively new to Quakerism and that my work had played some role in that. I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about that story.
Yeah, absolutely. So I first went to a Quaker meeting in November of 2021. And before that, I was part of a very, very conservative, fundamental, evangelical Christian church. Yeah. And my partner was not. We were trying to figure out how to mesh our beliefs together. And he asked me to go to a Quaker meeting with him. So I opened my heart a little bit to the thoughts of Quakerism, but I didn't know if I felt comfortable going to an actual meeting with people. So I started looking on the internet about, what is Quakerism? And very quickly, I found QuakerSpeak.
Yeah, the video project that I started in 2013.
Yes. I remember very specifically the first one that I watched was Are Quakers Christian? And there was an interview that said in Quakerism, there are no lay people because we all have God in us. And I thought that was a really beautiful sentiment. This really started kind of opening my eyes to that the Quakers each had their own faith and that was okay, and that the group as a whole was not purposed to change my faith or tell me what to believe, but that rather it was a guide to help learn how to live in this, I think the video might have even called it a dynamic spiritual presence, where we're focused on community and we're focused on helping people in the world right now. That's what convinced me to go to a meeting. And so I went to my first meeting and at Mountain View Friends meeting with my partner. We heard some of I think it was the Peace and Social Justice Committee. They stood up and they said, there was a recent shooting at a Jewish synagogue and that Mountain View was looking for people to volunteer to go stand outside of a Jewish synagogue on one of their upcoming holy days because they needed a peaceful, nonviolent presence so that the Jewish people could go and worship in peace. And that just sealed the deal.
Thank you so much, Erin. Appreciate you doing this spontaneously.
My pleasure, Jon. Have a good rest of your day.
Okay, you too. See you.
Bye-bye.
If you'd like to support our work, we want to keep having rich conversations like the ones that Erin discovered online that led her to Mountain View meeting. This weekly Quaker podcast that you're listening to right now is listener supported. So you can make a big difference by going to thequaker.org and pledging a monthly donation to our Patreon. Thanks so much for your consideration, and now back to Georgia.
Angelina is 32 years old in 1835 when she goes viral, in 19th century terms. It's been 6 or so years since she moved to Philadelphia, and about 14 since Sarah headed north. Conceivably, the sisters could have just kept living a quiet Quaker life and quietly supporting abolition. But that's not really Angelina's style. Remember, she's kind of a rebel. So she sends a letter to abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison after riots erupt in Boston, and he publishes that letter in his newspaper, The Liberator, no doubt knowing that the Grimke name carries weight.
The ground upon which you stand is holy ground. Never, never surrender it. If you surrender it, the hope of the slave is extinguished, and the chains of his servitude will be strengthened 100-fold. But let no man take your crown, and success is as certain as the rising of tomorrow's sun.
Angelina had already joined the Anti-Slavery Society, but this letter thrusts her into the spotlight.
And part of her, I'm sure, felt better, like, all right, I'm owning it. And it precipitated her into the abolitionist life because she became really famous from that letter.
The Quakers and Sarah are like telling Angelina, denounce this letter. He didn't have the right to publish what she wrote to him in his newspaper. And Angelina doesn't.
Now, one of the big questions is, why was Sarah opposed to Angelina writing that letter? And it was not because Sarah was opposed to the immediate abolition movement. What bothered her about Angelina's letter was that it really upset and disturbed the leadership of Arch Street Meeting, and where Sarah was trying to become an approved minister.
As a kid, Sarah had wanted to be a lawyer. Her father shot her down. But after a spiritual conversion experience, Louise says that Sarah immediately felt called to be a minister, something that obviously wasn't going to happen in most churches at the time, except for among the Quakers. Now, for Sarah to embrace her sister's radical abolitionism, which the Quaker leadership was against, she would lose another dream: to become a recorded Quaker minister who could travel beyond her own meeting to speak.
Because obedience was very important under the rules of the discipline, and Angelina she was going out on her own, right?
But Angelina won't back down. Indeed, she felt that as a Christian, she couldn't. Next, she writes the letter to the women of the South. It's not really a letter. It's 36 pages long and appeals to her fellow Southern women as Christians, laying out a biblical argument for denouncing slavery. And Angelina felt compelled by God to write it.
It was a spiritual crisis. She spent the night of that crisis weeping and praying on the floor of her bedroom.
Above all, try to persuade your husband, father, brothers, and sons that slavery is a crime against God and man, and that it is a great sin to keep human beings in such abject ignorance, to deny them the privilege of learning to read and write.
Angelina sends the letter to the American Anti-Slavery Society. They publish it and distribute it throughout the South. Sarah begins writing too. Not long after the letter to the women of the South, Sarah pens her own missive, but she appeals to ministers.
The system of slavery is necessarily cruel. The lust of dominion inevitably produces hardness of heart, because the state of mind which craves unlimited power, such as slavery confers, involves a desire to use that power. And although I know there are exceptions to the exercise of barbarity on the bodies of slaves, I maintain that there can be no exceptions to the exercise of the most soul-withering cruelty on the minds of the enslaved.
The sisters spend time in training with other abolitionists, and then they begin touring the North, visiting small groups of women in their parlors to speak not only about abolition, but about the rights of women. For the sisters, these two issues go hand in hand. All this time, the sisters knew they were risking disownment from their meeting. But they also knew that they had not technically disobeyed any Quaker rules. Still, their stance on slavery had begun to alienate them from many of their Quaker friends.
They both lost a lot of friends, most of their friends. Some of the Quakers in New York were still friendly to them and would invite them for meals, but would not put them up when they needed a place to stay.
They keep traveling and writing and speaking. Angelina especially gets attention for her speeches, so much so that she's the first woman invited to speak before an American legislative body, ever. She addresses the Massachusetts state legislature.
I stand before you as a Southerner, exiled from the land of my birth, by the sound of the lash and the piteous cry of the slave. I stand before you as a repentant slaveholder. I stand before you as a moral being, endowed with precious and inalienable rights, which are correlative with solemn duties and high responsibilities. And as a moral being, I feel that I owe it to the suffering slave and to the deluded master, to my country and the world, to do all that I can to overturn a system of complicated crimes, built up upon the broken hearts and prostrate bodies of my countrymen in chains, and cemented by the blood and sweat and tears of my sisters in bonds.
Only a portion of Angelina's words survive today, but we know that she also addresses the men with a push towards equal rights for women. Angelina's speech is in February 1838, only about 3 months before her wedding to fellow abolitionist Theodore Weld. The two already had a mutual attraction simply through reading each other's abolitionist publications. When they finally meet in person in 1836,
they both admit that's when they each locked eyes and fell in love. Because they already were in love from the letters. It was the real meeting of the minds.
It's 2 years before they get married, in part because the Grimkes are traveling for the cause. When they do finally get married, their wedding causes quite the stir. There were posters printed about the audacious amalgamation of races. That was a dirty word at the time. The wedding took place the same day as the dedication for Pennsylvania Hall. That was no coincidence. This new building in Philadelphia was constructed to give anti-slavery activists a place to speak. As Theodore Weld said, it was a place consecrated to free discussion and equal rights. 2 days after their wedding, Angelina spoke at Penn Hall as an angry mob of colonizers gathered steam outside. As she speaks, people are throwing rocks and yelling, but it doesn't faze Angelina.
What is a mob? What would the breaking of every window be? What would the leveling of this hall be? Any evidence that we are wrong or that slavery is a good and wholesome institution? What if the mob should now burst in upon us, break up our meeting, and commit violence upon our persons? Would this be anything compared to what the slaves endure? No. No.
There were lots of African-American women there and lots of white women there, and they walked out arm in arm to protect the black women from the violence of the mob. And the next day, Penn Hall burned down.
While the authorities watched. This was also pretty much the last time Angelina spoke publicly.
But it wasn't that she knew it at the time. And the idea was that Theodore bought a farm outside of New York City at Fort Lee, and the sisters were going there to rest. They had been working very hard, living always in other people's houses ever since they left Charleston. And so they were really excited to have a home of their own. They were going to go nest for a few months and rest, and then they were going to go back on the road.
But it wasn't to be. Angelina, who is in her mid-30s, gets pregnant and has 3 children and a few miscarriages in quick succession. She gets a prolapsed uterus and is not well for some time. Both Theodore and Sarah dissuade her from traveling. Both sisters wanted to keep writing. It just doesn't happen, not in any significant way. Plus, the family needed to work. Their Charleston inheritance had largely run out. So the sisters really only spent 3 years as public activists. There were certainly fellow abolitionists calling on the sisters to get back out in the field. But Louise also points out that there wasn't the precedent we have now to become a career activist.
We all feel disappointed the sisters didn't go back on the road, especially Angelina with all that talent.
Sarah, Angelina, and Theodore do collaborate on a tome of a book called Slavery as It Is, Testimony of 1,000 Witnesses. It details the horrors of slavery through firsthand accounts, including letters from both sisters. Harriet Beecher Stowe used the book as a reference for her novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. Later, they discover that they have nephews, Archibald and Francis, the sons of their deceased brother and an enslaved woman named Nancy Weston. And for the rest of their lives, the four maintain a close relationship. The sisters help them attend Harvard and Princeton, and it's Francis and Archibald, not Angelina and Theodore's children, who end up carrying on the work of fighting for equality for African Americans. Of course, their mother, Nancy Weston, who really pushed for the boys' education, played a large role in the men that they would become. Archibald goes on to become a lawyer, Frank becomes a prominent Presbyterian minister, and they both helped to found the NAACP.
Georgia, wow. Thank you so much for that story. I'm actually a little embarrassed I didn't know more about the Grimkes before now, but, I really appreciate your work on this.
Yeah, these women were such firebrands, and it would have just been so easy for them to have stayed within their safe, wealthy upbringing. And I think the image that I'm really left with is the one of Angelina weeping and praying all night because she's so convicted about writing this letter to her fellow Southern women.
Yeah, that moment really stuck out for me too. That's a powerful image.
I was also really fascinated about how the sisters' commitment to abolition really trumps their Quaker faith in a way. Like, they were really committed to Quakerism. They spoke using the traditional thee and thou. They wore plain dress. Their closest friends were capital F friends. But at the time, it seems many Quakers weren't quite yet willing to take as strong a stance against slavery as they were.
Right. They were even outliers within Quakerism, like they were pushing the envelope. So what happened with that? What happened with their Quakerism?
Yeah, well, they really towed the line for a while, but the wedding was a disownable offense.
The wedding? How so?
At the time, it was against the rules for a non-Quaker to marry a Quaker, so Angelina got kicked out. And it was also against the rules for a Quaker to witness such a wedding, and so Sarah got kicked out.
Oh, just to witness the wedding. Wow,
yeah.
It was so easy to get kicked out of Quakerism back then. I'm just happy that I got married in the 21st century.
Yeah, there's a lot to be grateful for about the 21st century.
Absolutely. And at the same time, and, despite all the messiness that you highlighted in this story, there's also something there that's kind of working on me. Like, what is the modern equivalent? What's the justice issue in our day that Quakers might be wrestling with?
Right. Like, who are the modern Grimke sisters that are kind of going against the grain?
Yeah. Who are the modern Grimke sisters?
Well, maybe we'll find the answer to that in a future episode.
Yeah, fair enough. Thanks, Georgia.
Thanks, John. Thanks for listening, and a special thank you to Leanne Bain and Louise W. Knight, as well as to Jim Fussell, who provided historical background for this episode. Thank you also to the William L. Clements Library at the University of Michigan for sharing letters from their extensive collection of correspondence from the Grimke and Weld families. Our voice actors were Kelly Lindsay and Kristen Osborne. So, what about Angelina and Sarah's story resonates with you? Head over to our website to share your thoughts. That's QuakerPodcast.com. And while you're there, you can also download a transcript from this episode. You can subscribe to the show, learn more about today's guests, and see Angelina and Theodore's provocative wedding invitation. This episode was produced by Jon Watts and me, Georgia Sparling. Jon also wrote the music for this episode. The Quaker Podcast is part of The Quaker Project, a brand new Quaker media organization whose focus is on lifting up voices of spiritual courage and giving Quakers a platform in 21st century media. If you want to support our work, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. We're a brand new project, and every contribution expands our capacity to tell Quaker stories in a fresh way. We make this show for you, so thank you for listening. Now that you've heard from us, it's time for us to hear from you. Tell us what it means to you to be a conscientious objector. Please give us a call and leave a voicemail at this number. Are you ready? 215-278-9411. Let me repeat that. 215-278-9411. If you tried the number before and couldn't get through, that's probably because I gave you the wrong one on a previous episode. My apologies. We do want to hear from you, so please give us a ring. Please try to keep it to a minute, and we might share your response on a future episode. Next week on the podcast, what happens when your calling seems to fly in direct opposition to your meeting?